As long as humans have had language, and probably even before that, they've told stories. Stories are a kind of technology, as well as a kind of culture, a way of trapping and containing meaning and information, ideas and thoughts. As much as it can be said that perhaps music taps into some primal relationship, a relationship with sound, with the heartbeat of our mothers as we grow in the womb, with emotion and the noises of the world, it could be said that stories tap into a primal thing as well, a way of containing life. But stories are unlike human lives in a very important way. They, as long as there are humans to breathe life into them and sustain them, are functionally immortal. This is obviously a big deal. Stories can stretch beyond the voice and pen of their original authors and reach into the seeming infinite, but this of course is another side effect. Like the human lives they parallel, the human cultures they contain, they evolve. They change over time. What they mean shifts, and as it shifts, the ideas that it holds shift as well. Superman, the great American superhero. An alien that crash lands on Earth after being sent away from his dying homeworld. As if it even needs being said, it's no surprise that Superman would resonate as an American icon, because functionally, like many Americans, Superman is an immigrant. An alien who goes on to embody the best ideals of the American dream. If you are an Italian, or Polish, or South American, or even a famous basketball player, Superman's story can resonate with you powerfully. You come from some rich old culture, but now find yourselves in America. You have to learn and embody the values of that place. Over time, Superman's strength and simplicity have been cynically indulged in, as with Zack Snyder's films, or parodied as with Homelander from The Boys. But the original appeal, I think, was this: an immigrant creation. It probably also won't surprise you to know that Superman's creators, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, were from immigrant families as well. A Jewish family that immigrated to Canada, and one that went to America. Forced to leave the growing tensions and violence of Europe, leaving behind their Kryptons to the now tragic destruction of the world wars. This, of course, can be found in the names of Superman and his father, Kal-El and Jor-El. The El is the same El as in Samael or Michael. In the old Semitic and Canaanite cultures, El meant God. It was also the name of the head of the pantheon of the Canaanites, who would fuse with Yahweh to become the prototype for the monotheistic God of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths. With time, the meaning and significance shifted, but within that faith of Judaism lies an even more dramatic example of what I'm talking about. The shifting of meaning within stories. The lost tribes of Israel, but really the lost 10. Israel, by the way, contains the same El, meaning God, of which the full name means the persistence of God. Within the writings, there are described a splitting of the United Kingdom of Israel into many other kingdoms. But of concern to us is the northern kingdom, which retained the name, and the southern kingdom of Judah. Ancient Israel was then conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and the writings describe its lost 10 northern tribes being vacated from their lands. How much this actually happened is of course contested. The point of this story was to highlight something originally, a difference. I don't think it will offend anyone to say that these religious texts serve to emphasize how God favored some groups over others. The Neo-Assyrians and their military might are well attested in the historical record. They did conquer the region sometime around the 700s BCE, and it's very likely people were displaced in that conflict. But in so clear-cut a fashion is less so likely. The Jewish historian Josephus, living during the Roman period, attested sometime in the 1st century, "There are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe, and 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude." When he was writing was also well after the Neo-Assyrian Empire declined, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire rose. They conquered Judah in 597 BCE. When Josephus wrote his words, he was distanced by over half a millennium from both events. But this video is not really about Jewish history, it's about stories, and I make mention of it because well beyond their creators, those stories have effects few could predict. What mattered here was that it was something everyone knew, an appealing nugget of an idea. There is a great sacred people who are lost. That's all the story really needed. Hundreds of years later in Africa, this idea took root. In Ethiopia, those who converted to Judaism believed themselves members of these same 10 lost tribes. They formed Beta Israel, which, despite sounding like Second Israel, actually means House of Israel, House of the Persisting God. All that is needed is the notion of a lost people, and you can see your own history in its open-ended question. But what happened to them? In medieval Europe, to answer what happened to them, the Christian countries believed of a mythic Christian king, somewhere in Central Asia or the Orient, Prester John. He must have these missing tribes, somewhere beyond the edge of the map, amidst the Muslims and pagan kingdoms of Asia. But in the 1200s, 2,000 years after their supposed deportation, Jacques de Vitry, Bishop of Acre, believed that the armies of the kingdom of Prester John were heading towards Jerusalem. Hearing rumor of an unstoppable army heading west across Asia, a Christian king descended from Prester John, with an army descended from the lost 10 tribes. Of course, rather comically, the group he was actually hearing about was the Mongol Empire. The notion that the legendary tribes had very boringly, long ago, simply amalgamated back into the area around Israel or Judah, or merged in its deported areas of Babylon, was simply not as appealing as the question, but where did they go? And this story went even further, reached out across time to a continent Josephus and the ancient Jewish writers didn't even know existed, the home of Superman, America. In the colonization of the world, Europeans were confronted with peoples they simply did not know existed. This will be very important later, I assure you. In that way, they tried to fit these people into their stories they already believed, tried to fit them into the mysteries never solved. But where did the lost tribes go was one of them. When Lewis and Clark famously set out on their expedition across North America, then US President Thomas Jefferson instructed the explorers to look for signs of Jewish culture within the peoples they met. Yes, this same line of thinking is where the Church of Latter-day Saints formed and got its ideas from. That Native Americans were perhaps the Jews that were punished for not believing in Jesus Christ. The story that began with those Jewish writers had crossed an ocean, and gone thousands of years away from their original source, and over 2,000 years from the Neo-Assyrians, Judah, and Israel, to find the sunny waves of the Pacific, but none of the lost tribes. In the same colonization of the America, vast amounts of people were imported forcibly from Africa to be laborers on plantations. These people, also being liberated to some degree or another, though not as much as some would have hoped, after the Civil War, sought to find some of their missing history, and amongst them emerged several groups who saw themselves once again mirrored within these lost 10 tribes. As we marched into the 20th century, the lingering appeal of this idea was still so powerful that it mutated further. It transformed into fiction, and then, most precious to me, science fiction. The moving and the conquering of a Semitic people 2 millennia ago became a fleet of spaceships crossing the stars headed by the Galactica. It became a moon-shaped mothership fighting their way back to their home planet. But something else happened over that time. The shift to capitalism and consumerism. Namely, the shift to private ownership. Suddenly, stories needed copyrights, trademarks, and so on. Billions of dollars in merchandising. People demanded compensation, and this did not really mesh well with the truth. That stories are a form of life that does not work within those bounds. Like a virus of the mind, they spread and they mutate. So, today I want to tell you about 2 things, 2 versions, 2 stories, but really about what they have in common. The story they came from, the story of Atlantis, the lost city, the lost continent. I love Atlantis, and I love stories about it. But therein lies the main issue. How they change and who owns them, and how did they get copied? Specifically, did the 2001 movie Atlantis the Lost Empire copy, rip off, or steal from the 1990s Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water? It's so appealing. The big evil Disney stealing from the underdog Gainax, Western cartoons stealing from anime. But really, did they do it? I mean, guy with glasses, dark-skinned exotic lady, dark-skinned exotic lady. Crystals and, crystals? Jules Verne submarine, Mike Mignola to Ultraman? Wait, did they? Did Disney steal from Gainax? Inspired in part by Your Movie Sucks, Great, Kimba vs. The Lion King video. Pretty great, check it out. I felt it was about time to do my own. But this isn't going to be some simple review either. Because fundamentally, I don't respect either of these corporations. But I do respect stories. I love them, and I do respect many of the hardworking artists who made them. I will tackle this claim and in the process show you the wonder, my wonder at the amazing story of Atlantis, how that story changed, what it meant, the secret of that lost place. First off, a big thanks to the patrons, who make all of this very much possible. Skuttlefish, Mavrilin, Emil, Sai, John L., Thermidor Otstarva, Lucas Machin, DeepStateNine, Rylan Browner, Rendar, Francisco Esqueda, Luis Correa, Domestica 1664, Cake, Andrew Ziggas, Speedking Oz, Mike Murdock, Excelsis Caeli, Kuropiko, MiracleMajutsu, Treatea, Victorine, Zachary Tebbal, Julian Johnson, JXP, KDZ, AJ Brown, Gen Zino, I Feed My Atlas Green Chicken, Carl Hager, notverysbtle, arcticArduino, Ethan Banks, OsakanOne, Metal Dragon, Mathieu TITARRO, golgariSoul, Marcus Aaron Stroud, Alpharius Omegon, and Ninebreaker. With that, let me show you Atlantis. I will show you the power of humankind, the power of human stories, how they change, and what it means to change, because Argenbolt and Red Eric enter. Hello, Argenbolt. I am here. I am very excited to learn about Atlantis, and about the Disney thing, or whatever. Very good. I am about to tell you some very important stuff, but also, while you learn, I'm going to get very angry. Angry? At me? No, at a group of people who are incredibly dense, dumb motherfuckers. Some real pin-headed dipshits. But yes, also learning. Wow. I'm not entirely sure that is justified, but let us begin anyways. Maybe this will start to make sense for me. Right, so let us begin. Basically, the best place to start, of course, would be with Plato. After all, Plato was the one who described Atlantis. But in that specific detail there is a lot of people who simply don't fucking bother to learn it. But you bothered to learn it, right? Perhaps inspired by some fictional works which will be included at a later time in this video? That is right. You are a handsome and smart character for noticing. The specific work actually is great because it can tell us a lot of what Atlantis originally meant, and in learning that, we can see just how much it changed. The source is Timaeus by Plato, right? Exactly. Not the Republic, not some work on geography either of the ancient world, but in fact, Timaeus. Most people never read Timaeus, let alone understand its purpose. One of the most obvious things about Timaeus, really, is like many Greek and Platonic works, a dialogue. Right, a conversation between characters. Yes, the Greeks enjoyed using this style because it feels a bit more natural than just a lecturing series of prose. It creates the idea of this being an account of a discussion and allows for personality to emerge from each character to teach things. You know, like great wisdom. Or earnest inquisitive questioning. Absolutely, Red Eric. Of course, the use of this is all rhetorical, a way of arguing and presenting a point. Really, a story argument is a good way of thinking about it. I mean, imagine it like this. You could just eat half a pound of mozzarella and chow down on a stick of pepperoni, drink tomato sauce and eat dough fried in olive oil. But when you arrange and present them, and bake them, the elements form a kind of pizza. The flavors can combine and voila! A dialogue is like a pizza. A story argument presenting an idea in a more flavorful way. In that case, my main question would be, who in the dialogue is present, and what is Timaeus about? As before we even get to Atlantis, I think that may tell us something, right? Of course. So naturally, a big thing people probably don't know is Timaeus isn't actually about geography. Like I mentioned, in fact, Timaeus is mostly about the divine order of the cosmos. It's about basically how Plato thought the world originated, and in what was its structure. In particular, it's the origin of the phrase demiurge as a mythological thing, because to Plato, the true world of forms, the ideal world, was perfect, but it wasn't ours. This world was created by the demiurge, imposing onto chaos the order of the world. Demiurge generally just meant a magistrate or civil servant of the people. The demios, peoples, ergos, working doer. Wait, this is the Platonic one, right? That the Gnostics mention? As mentioned in your On the Big O video? Yes, it is. It is very likely that the Gnostics directly reinterpreted a very conceptual demiurge as the false creator of the universe. In fact, Plato's Republic was included in the Nag Hammadi library, so the Gnostics were very clearly fans. But what about Atlantis? This sounds like it's mostly about some great deal of stuff that just isn't Atlantis related. Yes, in fact, you are correct. Altogether, Atlantis is but one long paragraph. You may be starting to realize something that I will reveal in short time. But to finally fill in the rest of the context and answer your other question about who is present and who speaks of it, in truth, both questions have the same answer. Plato himself is, of course, not present. But in fact, the group is Socrates, Plato's teacher, Hermocrates, a general from Syracuse, the Greek colony in Sicily, Critias, of whose exact identity is somewhat uncertain, and Timaeus, of whom the dialogue is named. Wait, did all these historical figures really meet? Are they all real people? No. You see, Plato is the author, and the account is framed as a dialogue, but it's basically a fiction where the choice of characters highlight a contrasting group of opinions. It's a way of, like I said, flavoring the dialogue itself. Importantly, for the Atlantis section, Hermocrates is present. Remember this. Like, say, a totally hypothetical random meeting of a girl King Arthur, Twink Gilgamesh, and Bara Alexander the Great, the point is who is speaking. More to your exact point, though, the one actually who speaks of Atlantis is Critias. Ah, so Critias knows Atlantis. Well, not exactly. The specific speaker, Critias, is actually telling the story that his grandfather told him when he, Critias the Younger, the speaker, was 10, and his grandfather, Critias the Elder, was 90. But in truth, the ones who told him was Dropides, Critias the Elder's father, the speaker Critias the Younger's great-grandfather, and the one who told him was Solon. Yes, that's Solon, the wisest of the 7 sages who laid the foundations of Athenian democracy. Ah, okay. So, Solon is the source, and more importantly, how does this bone matter to our understanding of Atlantis? Well, actually, Solon only knows of it because he heard of it while traveling to the Egyptian city Sais, in which yet another grandpa old-ass man told it to him. It is this unnamed elderly priest who attests he has records of a mythical time wherein the story of Atlantis is first recounted. So yes, a big stack of no less than 5 old guys. But why? Why such a white beard-length list as that? I'll have to get to that actually. You see, this old man of Sais says, well, a lot of stuff, things we will get to in a second, but the very, very important one is that actually, the modern Athens Solon has founded, so, the one 2,600 years ago to us, is actually the second one. There was, in fact, a super Athens which existed, as according to the old man, 8,000 to 9,000 friggin' years beforehand, but which mirrored Solon's in many ways, not the least of which the construction of Athens itself. Wait, no one mentions this part. Super Athens of, what would that be, 9,300 BCE? 11,000 years ago? Yes, well, you know what, I'm just going to give it to you. The actual chunk in its entirety about Atlantis, specifically, and then do the big reveal. This is, as the old says man says, his story. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories, but one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are, by what you call, the Pillars of Hercules. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass into the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Hercules, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other's the real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Now, in this island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire, which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Treaea, basically Italy. This vast power, gathered into one, endeavored to subdue At a blow, our country and yours and the whole of the region within the straits, and then, Solon, your country, shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men and bodies sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of this island. Wow, really, that is it? Atlantis was defeated militarily by Super Athens and then loses favor with the gods and is destroyed? Yup, and that is why it is now time to stop this framing, and reveal why these old guys. Who was Super Athens? What exactly was the point of this story? What did it originally mean? Well, surprise! The Platonic ideal of Atlantis is just a metaphor, stupid. Yeah, hopefully this doesn't, blow anybody away, but like Plato's dialogue, Atlantis' story is a metaphorical story whose point is not a literal description of a fucking place. This is the incredible thing which all the History Channel morons fail to understand. This may actually astound you, but people think Atlantis is real and a physical location, but those same people are some of the least imaginative idiots out there. But how can that be? They believe in Atlantis. I know, right? But it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect of, ancient history. The less imagination and conceptualization you have, the more you need these ideas to represent special, literal places and things. The guys who get excited over, studying pot shards and arrowheads and fragments of rope, those guys have so much imagination because they know just how significant all those little things are to describing our very real history. Likewise are those who can enjoy and grasp the use of fictional ideas to illustrate metaphorical things. The people who go out looking for lost golden pyramids under the ocean are some of the least imaginative, fucking moronic dipshits out there. Like those who only know historical figures from, say, gacha games. So here, let me tell you the point of this story argument bluntly. This metaphor. In short, Plato was a philosopher, but really he was a thinker. He existed in a society which, altogether, didn't orbit around his learned kind. Plato's Republic, then, the earlier work, is really thus a prescriptive attempt at redefining that thing, the polis, the city, or really the civilization. Plato was trying to provide a guide and order of what he believed would create an ideal state, one which did not fall victim to military dictators or cruel autocratic kings. Plato's Timaeus, then, is literally a continuation of that. It is set exactly a day after the dialogue of the Republic. Plato, through his character, basically says, yeah, well, that ideal city stuff, it's great and all, but couldn't we make it a bit more entertaining somehow? Narratively? With a story? In that way, the original Atlantis story operates on two levels. The first is really the more obvious one. The old man is from Sais, a city which Creteus claims to share the same patron god as Athens, that being the Egyptian god Neith, which to the Greeks is Athena. Look here, it is a mirror. If I place this mirror over the supposed territory of Atlantis, like that, it is mirrored over Asia. So, is there a state which occupied this area in Plato's lifetime? Of course there is. The Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire as it is known, the one which famously was fought by the Spartans at Thermopylae, and whose navy of King Xerxes was repulsed at the Battle of Salamis, a century before Plato. So here, Plato is not literally saying there was a Super Athens, nor that Atlantis was a real place 9,000 years previous, but that Athens, with its just constitution, must resist and liberate the world. Herein lies the appeal of Creteus' stack of old men as well. It isn't an arbitrary list or some cheap way of saying this happened a long time ago. Plato is appealing to a mythical genealogy here. Creteus, possibly that Creteus, student of Socrates himself, who would lead the 13 tyrants. through his lineage back to Drupides, who was alive with Solon when he created the Athenian constitutional reform, and is said to be, by Aristotle, the first people's champion. Hell, even the setup of a Greek traveling to Sais in Egypt to learn may have been Plato basing his characters on Herodotus' travels, as Herodotus, known to us today, really, as the father of history, was one of the first people to try and record it. Is Plato implying Herodotus found out about a real Atlantis? No, but Plato is likely taking advantage of the prestige and common awareness of Herodotus' writings. The ancient world was really quite small intellectually in terms of the body of knowledge. So Plato, alluding to a Greek going to Egypt, would very likely evoke Herodotus' travels to his audience. It's another way of reinforcing this story came from great sources. To use a mirror of metaphor again, it's like me telling you that I met Obama, and Obama gave me a story told to him by Bill Clinton, who heard it from JFK when he was 20, who got it from Teddy after finding it in an archive, originally written by Abe Lincoln, based on an account from George Washington. And the story is about how 1 million years ago there was a super America, and that super America is just like modern America, but better in every way, and we need to evoke this perfect original to defeat China and go to Mars and build the Stargate program. The point is not that any of this shit ever fucking happened ever, but that who said it, and how they said it, adds a grandiosity to the supposed story, rather than, I just made this shit up. This is the heritage of prestige which denotes that future Athens, like the one laid out in Plato's Republic, must invoke of super Athens, and be friggin' hella epic and learned and based and cool into the future as well. So to borrow some wrestling terms, Atlantis is just a big heel, a baddie, a villain, which Athens, the face, the hero, defeats. All metaphorical. But there is a second, darker irony to the story as well. Remember I said Hermocrates being there is important? Well, because for those who don't know, Hermocrates was the Syracusan general who famously helped defeat Athens in the invasion of Sicily. Yeah, you may have noticed there's something weird going on here, especially in the lines, "In a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men and bodies sank into the earth." Huh. Your warlike men. Your warlike Athenian men. Here, I must admit I lied a little bit, as there is another of Plato's dialogues which mentions Atlantis in quite a lot of detail. It is the aptly named Critias. I won't read the full excerpt here because it's, namely, far too long, but also because it's incomplete. It is the one which provides the wonderfully illustrated description of a concentric city, filled with rings of water and land, with ripe fruit and vegetable, animals of every kind, great temples, a palace laid out at the center of this great island empire, so on and so on. A naval empire built around a great harbor. Most of the artistic depictions of Atlantis stem from this later work. But the main thing I want to pluck from that is the fact that Poseidon was the patron god of the island of Atlantis, his son Atlas being its first king. As those with some knowledge of Greek mythology may recall, in Athens there was a contest of who would be the patron god. Athena, which won, or yes, who lost? Poseidon. Are you starting to see where I'm going with this? Starting to get it? Below the noble parable of Super Athens versus Atlantis is a darker, more ironic tone. The inclusion of Hermocrates in particular highlights this, as does the line from Timaeus of the warlike men being plunged into the earth. Namely, that Atlantis is also Athens, or more specifically, that Super Athens and Atlantis are merely themselves a dichotomy of virtuous and passion-driven people. Like the Greeks and Trojans of Homer's Iliad, Atlantis is not even just a simple metaphor for how Athens should be ideal. Rather, Athens and Atlantis are the same thing, the same idea, like Superman and Lex Luthor, of how a noble society may fall and be destroyed by losing grace with the gods. A mirror, as Athens was humiliated in its attempted invasion of Sicily, of which Hermocrates would head the anti-Athenian alliance. Literally, Athens did stand mostly alone, but not because it was a virtuous state defending liberty, but because it had tried to dominate the Aegean as a tyrant. This is the darker story and meaning within Timaeus, and Critias by Plato, of a warning of a fall from grace. This is ultimately the supreme irony of Plato's inclusion of Atlantis. All the genealogies of famous old men and characters using them are merely a container for a story a story about an over-eager Athenian, a way of insisting authenticity to cover up the actual meaning through fiction. It is worth noting, also, that Plato himself, in the previous work, The Republic, outright says societies make use of Gaineu pseudos, literally the noble lie, to reinforce their power structure and identity. The noble lie is the mythology of the polis, the city, but really even more simply, it's the story of a people that they tell themselves to justify their power over others, and their traditions. It's the structure and identity of the state. That Athens was chosen by Athena, or that the Spartans were not Greeks, but a superior race, and not a bunch of gay, tyrannical slaver child army users. These are examples of noble lies in action. Atlantis is merely one crafted by Plato. An elaborate fiction nested in prestige to show how both the supposed greatness and villainy of what was Athens itself. The core idea may merely just to have been, in Plato's work, to try and evoke the ideal of Athens through an outlandish myth of lost empires, only for Creteus to insist, No, it's true actually! Atlantis was likewise all a story argument by Plato, about just that befalling his ideal society when it loses its core values and becomes militaristic and expansionist. Once again, not a literal ruin or actual geographic place at all. Only, what I am about to ask next may surprise you. If this is all it was, why was this notion so entertaining? Why was the simple inclusion of a mere few paragraphs in such a larger work the seed of an idea which came down to us through over 2 millennia of history? Well, because the Platonic ideal of Atlantis was a bunch of real places. It goes without saying that for a story to endure over time, it does need to catch the imagination of people. It needs to put down the roots with which it will grow and change over time. This, for me, is perhaps the true tragedy of Atlantis as a concept, because sure enough, like many other folks, I would say the idea of a lost empire is absolutely fascinating. It is what caught and stuck in my mind at a young age from all those works we will get to in a little bit. But in pursuit of that novel idea, I, one day, back in 2017, found out about Eric H. Klein's lecture, and through that book, of which I cannot recommend enough, sorry if you didn't see this coming, you know, the big one of the greatest enemies of mankind, was what I discovered. The Bronze Age collapse, or more specifically, the system's collapse. Here for me lies the true miserable tragedy of Atlantis. The reason the idea fits so well, when voiced by Plato, of this catastrophic fall in a single day and night, of mighty empires effectively extinguished, of a time in the late Bronze Age, when everything was great, and then it really wasn't, was because of this. It was a time when huge trade networks crisscrossed the Mediterranean Ocean, when huge superpowers like the Hittites or Egyptian Empire waged wars. But they also signed the earliest recorded peace treaties. In the wake of those treaties, Egypt built some of its most famous monuments. In the Fertile Crescent, powerful city-states thrived, and the Phoenician sailors plied the trade circuit, from Egypt up to the Mycenaeans of Greece, the distribution of tin and copper to make bronze building tools, and massive armies of mighty chariots. A plethora of smaller powers like Elam and the Mitanni, and the Cypriots all existed as well. Then came droughts, famines, rebellions, wars, invasions of the desperate sea peoples, migrating and invading merely to flee from disaster elsewhere, only to then fade and vanish from history soon after. An age of destruction so brutal even hundreds of years later, its memories and its pain linger on. Within Timaeus we can see Plato echo just that. And I will tell you, there have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. The Old Man of Sighs recounts just that. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. At such times, those who live upon the mountains and in dry and lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity the Nile, who is our never-failing savior, delivers and preserves us. When on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, the survivors in your country are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell in the mountains. but those who, like you, live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. Over and over, the memory of the glorious age and its fall is echoed in human history, a painful piece of narrative scar tissue from a terrible wound. Within Greek myths, the end of the golden race of men and the age of heroes, the disruption at the end of the Iliad, and yes, the plagues of Egypt, the fall of Jericho in the Old Testament, all are this. In the first place, you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. And in the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written record or word. For there was a time, Solon, before the great deluge of all, when the city which now is Athens was first in war, and in every way the best governed of all cities. It is said to have performed the noblest deeds, and to have had the fairest constitutions of any which tradition tells, under the face of heaven. These coping mechanisms, these stories, they are the ways humans tried to reconcile an age of unparalleled pain and suffering. This is also why I despise those fools who chased the ruins of Atlantis. This is why I pretty much hate them. Misunderstanding Greek metaphor is one thing. Stupid, but far less tragic or unexpected. The reality, though, was there was this miserable human destruction. And sometimes, just for a moment, I feel the weight of that tragedy in its full scale. A blood-chilling, aching tragedy, hundreds of years long. Thousands upon thousands of suffering, long-past human lives. Human stories. Those who try to claim it as one place, or even one event, the destruction of the Minoans from a volcano or so on, are just as ignorantly looking for a single headstone or tomb amongst one of the largest mass graves of human culture and history. That tragedy, a black ocean of human souls of the dead hanging above me, while those blind fools tried to find glory in some ruins, ignorant to this weight and the depth and the power of the very real story of humankind. Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, all ruins. This is why I hate them, as Plato put wonderfully in Timaeus. You Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man amongst you. Solon in return asked him what he meant. I mean to say, he replied, that in mind you are all young. This is why Atlantis clicked, why it meshed, and why it was so appealing. Because very real people had lived through very real tragedies that had existed. Even if half remembered and with no great written records, the wound and the melancholic nostalgia this lost continent and its empire embodied were that. A missing chunk of cultural flesh, 300 years wide. But that was thousands of years ago. It's time to move forward, because, as I began, stories inevitably change. The story of Atlantis was, of course, no different. And the irony and tragedy of its story had just begun. At the time Plato died in 348 BCE, a boy was already living. A boy who would demonstrate an extreme proficiency for violence. A boy who, when at the young age of 20, would be crowned king of Macedonia. A king, and then military leader, who perhaps perfectly embodied Plato's attempted warnings of his story of Atlantis. A leader who would in fact be tutored by Plato's student, Aristotle, who, with might of arms, would spend the next 12 years to become what the Greek unifiers had long awaited. One whose military acumen was mythologically good, but whose political abilities were laughably unequipped to deal with the stabilization of this vast empire he created. Alexander the Great would die at age 32. His empire would fall overnight, piece by piece, to the infighting of his followers. Over the passage of time, from the place once described as Treatea, would come a power which would do far better, in short order, and would conquer quite powerfully. They would create another empire on par with Plato's allegorical Atlantis. Rome. Enduring far longer before suffering from themselves great systemic issues leading to its fracturing and eventual decline. A drop in the standard of living. The creation of the seeds of what will become the medieval states to follow. As Thomas Cole would paint many years later quite succinctly, the course of empire. Alexander and Rome would come shortly, and then well after, Plato's story. But I mention their rise and fall because I think they reinforce what would make Atlantis an enduring myth, and also what would allow it to be reinterpreted well outside its original message or meaning. All the nuances of the story pertaining to Athens being metaphorical, being itself perhaps a criticism, taking myths too seriously to affirm greatness. These were eroded by the waves of time washing over it. What was left was a melancholic notion of lost greatness, lost power, the Dark Ages of medieval Europe. And what was to follow? The Renaissance, and an adamant soaking in of the classics of Greek and Roman history and their stories. We here skip forward somewhat to the 1800s. The 1800s were in many ways a time which could have used a good dose of what Plato was trying to get at. Namely, that looking for lost ancient greatness in myths is kind of stupid, and that in truth society should fear becoming too militaristic and expansionist, and losing their virtue and morality in the pursuit. Instead, the Europeans did the opposite. The French mythologized Vercingetorix, and saw themselves as the noble Gauls resisting the expanding new evil Roman Empire of Germany, despite the fact that their ancestors would have denounced those same Gauls as pagans and savages. Germany and Italy unified, and looked to the actual Roman Empire as an inspiring, dominant, conquering lineage. Britain, in controlling the massive British Empire, naturally saw itself as the true heir apparent to this progressive cycle of empires. That's why a bunch of weird, crazy, island-dwelling Germano-Franco-Brittonic inbreeds feel they deserve to call their battleships mythological Greek heroic names, like Agamemnon. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion translated the Rosetta Stone, itself a trophy brought back by Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Con man Heinrich Schliemann, at the behest of the British archaeologist Frank Calvert, dug and blasted away Hissarlik to proclaim the discovery of Troy. Like the desperate character of Critias of Plato's original Timaeus story, European empires and then European archaeologists grew positively addicted to ancient stories of the past, as excuses or even just justifications or maybe just context for their modern industrialized militant empires. The raw Platonic irony spun Plato's bones so fast they achieved escape velocity on June 19th and left orbit. Eventually this would become the modern field of archaeology, which I do greatly respect. But this video isn't about that. It's really about Atlantis, and about how stories evolve. So, with that in mind, we must return to the place this video began with, the home of Superman, America. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly, an American statesman, published a book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Pause for a moment and consider that date specific to the history of the United States. 1882. Less than 20 years after the horrifically devastating U.S. Civil War, the most bloody war in North American history. A war so bad, antebellum was christened to describe the pre-war glory. Antebellum, before the war. You know, kinda like antediluvian, before the flood. This is the core kind of appeal an American audience would have. This is where the book's claims came in about the actual Atlantis. And yes, I did learn most of this from Atanche's fantastic video. You should watch it if you want to know more about Ignatius Donnelly specifically, and the origins of pseudoscience. It's a great vid. Basically, Donnelly puts forward that 12,000 years ago, yes, taking Plato's fictional Cretaceous figure and tacking on another 3 millennia to account for the Christ times, a super civilization of Atlantis not only controlled but ruled the entire world. Not even just Plato's original humble chunk of Libya and Asia. Not good enough. After all, in the centuries of exploration, we now had much bigger maps to fill. To impress a modern audience, details like this need to be changed. If, for example, I ask you right now, what does Noah's Ark look like? You would probably say, well, duh, the big long boat, right? I mean, you've seen Fantasia, you've seen the Noah Ark Encounter amusement park in Kentucky. Only you would be wrong, because the original Noah's Ark story, as it was described before ever being written down in a Bible, actually had the Noah's Ark look like this, a coracle. What is a coracle exactly? It's basically a simple woven reed boat that is a circle and you can paddle down a river on top of. Because when the first versions of the story were being written, Bronze Age civilization had not invented the long, narrow naval architecture we now think of as obvious. Even something like a Greek trireme would kind of be like a nuclear aircraft carrier for those folks. Because in the Fertile Crescent, most people lived along what? Rivers. So the original Noah's Ark was a gigantic coracle. Dr. Irving Finkel, Babylonian scribe wizard of the British Museum, helped make a slightly scaled down version, which was actually built. This is a great example of one of the big indicators of stories changing. As our awareness gets bigger, so too do the demands on the details needed to increase as well. So Noah's River Coracle Ark became a long-covered, ocean-going boat, which in the hit documentary 2012 by Roland Emmerich became a super-duper metal cruise ship. Or, what if, for a modern science fiction audience, was an alien superstructure? Or flying saucer, perhaps? But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Returning to Donnelly and his engorged Atlantis, after ruling the entire Earth, huge cataclysms befell the civilization, and thus the survivors went on to found the peoples and cultures we know of today. Not just in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, but the entire Earth. Returning, though, Donnelly's claims were highly influenced by Donnelly's life. The life of a man born to Irish immigrant parents in Philadelphia. A city which I would note got its name, ironically, from Ptolemy II's reconstruction of what had been the city of Ammon, which was conquered by Alexander the Great. If the appeal of Atlantis is historical melancholy, Philadelphia's name is also another great example. Donnelly was largely anti-capitalist and had even moved out to the then frontier of Minnesota, helping homesteaders there, though they were all then hit very badly by the financial collapse of 1857. In terms of actual politics and his career, he was an abolitionist and became a member of the Republican Party. No, not the modern Republican Party, this is before the party switch. Which meant he was progressive and pro-union during the Civil War. He was clearly a man of high ideals, in search of an ideal kind of American civilization, one made by the sweat of men's brows and not by Wall Street bankers. But having experienced in his life the failure of that same frontier community, and also, the American Civil War, would be pretty brutal for a guy. Once again, Atonche's video goes in much greater detail here, but I mention this for largely two reasons. One, to prove that Donnelly, like the creators of Superman, also immigrants, put his ideals into a hugely appealing fiction which would influence many later stories. What, you thought that beginning part was unrelated? Krypton got destroyed like Atlantis, right? That's no coincidence at all. But also, two, because to the man's credit, outside of participating in one of the numerous US Native American conflicts, he was largely kind of a progressive man politically, and for the time, wasn't really a cold-hearted racist. This is tragic, because while stories changing is the main idea of this video, not all changes are for the best, and while Donnelly's ideas were an insane pseudoscience that missed Plato's original values, what would come would also be perhaps one of the most wonderful moments of historical dark irony, simultaneously still missing all of Plato's points, and also Donnelly's idealism as well. Graham Hancock is a fucking moron. Who is Graham Hancock? How is the Atlantis story getting racist? Well, you don't have to go too far to see how this could happen. To recap, if Atlantis is claimed to be a physical place, but really, Atlantis is an appealing narrative nugget that got taken out of its original context, you don't have to go too far to see how someone would use this idea maliciously. If you are already willing to accept the existence of a super civilization that vanished with no to little physical evidence, then it wouldn't be a stretch to start adding some nationalism or racism into the mix. That's why I began this section noting these ideas in this context. What if all these weird, exotic, so non-white, people civilizations were in fact created by an ancient super race? Not even aliens, that's right, as Atonche put it wonderfully, ancient Aryans. As I mentioned very early in this video, as the age of exploration found new cultures, unknown to Europeans, they had to face some big facts. Namely, that what was once a clear lineage of history and civilization, going from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and then into Europe, was now a lot bigger and less clear. People had actually created civilization all over the friggin' place, fairly diversively at different times with different cultures. This is called nuance. Say it with me. Nuance. Like Plato's original use of Atlantis, nuance is something you have to not be an idiot to accept. Here then comes Donnelly's, unfortunately, juicy idea. That there was in fact, still is, a clear, neat source for all of this. An advanced, superior source for all of this. We have now arrived at racist Atlantis. Like racist Hyperborea or those wacky skull-wearing Germans' ideas of the Aryan super-civilization, we have arrived at the modern History Channel tier understanding of Atlantis. Because if you don't like brown people from weird places, maybe their cultural achievements were secretly enabled by a lost civilization of white people. We have also arrived at Graham the Pinhead Hancock, a man whose sloppy archaeology has destroyed actual historical sites. Who does psychedelic drugs, man, to think of the aliens, man. Whose constant fallback when his nutjob theories are challenged is that, we haven't looked for an ancient, Atlantean super civilization hard enough. Until laser sonar topography proves there isn't a goddamn golden pyramid somewhere on the seafloor, then Atlantis could exist. Now, is Hancock himself a massive racist intentionally? No. He seems to be just another insecure wannabe Indiana Jones type pseudoscientist. But accidentally racist? Oh, heck yeah he is! Graham Hancock is a man who will regurgitate racist 1800s arguments without so much as a lick of nuance or critical analysis. Like the fictional Old Man of Sais in Plato's story, taking advantage of appealing to the authority of historical figures. Hancock will use Donnelly and other, just as crazy or even more crazy, racist claims from the 1800s because, hey, an old guy said it, so maybe it could be true. NASA recently reported that the historical irony got so dense that Plato's bones have approached light speed beyond the orbit of Neptune. To use one very painful example, Hancock tries to claim that the Olmec heads, visually looking like Africans, are proof that maybe the Olmecs were themselves a transplanted population from Africa, or perhaps were taught by Atlanteans in contact with Africa. Yes, unironically, in blunt terms, because the Olmec heads have faces that look like black people faces, they could have been made by black people sculptures, or Mesoamericans taught about black people, by Atlanteans. Hopefully, your face isn't too red from how hard you smacked it just now. Of course, Graham conveniently forgets that humans can evolve regional traits independently, like, say, large nose with wide airways in response to hot and humid environments. Kind of like how Southeast Asians, Indians, Africans, and South Americans very often have flared nostrils. The function of the nose is to filter in warm air, after all. Colder climates, narrower nose. Warmer climates, wider nose. But man, where's the secret civilization? Wouldn't it be cool, man? Of course, most of the time Hancock doesn't even really have the balls to call it Atlantis. It's just this unnamed thing, but who knows what it could be. Or, as another painfully stupid example Hancock's shroom-melted brain would struggle with, how the Ainu of Japan, and the northern Japanese islands very specifically, in response to living in colder climates, have lighter skin, and even occasionally had blue or gray eyes. Because with dimmer daylight for most of the year, the skin doesn't need to use as much energy producing melanin to block UV rays. And actually, absorbing sunlight to produce vitamin D is kind of a big deal, so getting paler might actually help with that. This is also why the Inuit of the high Arctic Circle can be both pale and also very tanned, because the Arctic is both very dark at times, but also, because snow is so reflective, and ice as well, very, very bright. So you can also have very tanned Inuit. But once again, this is so boring. Where's Atlantis? Where's the pizzazz, Humans adapt to their environment and stimuli. Where's the room for Atlantis? This is why I said, fuck Hancock. Not because he's the worst guy out there directly, but because his unintentionally racist theories can mesh so well with the prejudices of far more racist pseudoscience. Or to be very blunt, because his ideas are ideas from the 1800s, and he doesn't do anything to unfuck them. They end up carrying over a lot of those same outdated racist subtones. When the first Europeans found the temples of the Mayans, they thought that they'd surely been built by someone else than the natives that were directly around them. They saw elephants in the carvings and theorized that maybe Indians from India could have been involved because the current brown people here are clearly too savage to have constructed them. And Hancock's ideas help keep these dumb ideas alive into the modern day. So yeah, don't be Graham Hancock. Hancock is basically a modern-day Heinrich Schliemann. A man pretending to be an archaeologist who would ignore, then happily dynamite and bulldoze, and has, actual precious human history to support his disillusions and fantasies. A fucking idiot who does not deserve the legacy of the story of Atlantis. So, is that it then? Is Atlantis fucked? Is it doomed to be the eternal fluff nonsense shown to the dwindling number of boomers who watch TV? in between reruns of Ice Road Truckers and Hitler's Secret Pet Alien? Can we, as a modern audience, engage with this idea, with this story? Absolutely! I fucking love Atlantis, and I think you should as well. Not only that, but we don't actually have to lose that nuance. It's also actually possible to have our lost sunken cake and eat it too. This is why learning this history is so important. I wouldn't have done this if I hated Atlantis. Because, after all, just as stories can transform in negative ways, just as Atlantis was misused for just that, they can also be rebuilt. Stories can rise from the depths of gross, older cultural context and become entirely new and wonderful things, all without losing their original appeal, or even better, by bringing back something nuanced once lost beneath the waves of time. It is a hot June over 20 years ago. A much younger version of myself is sitting in an air-conditioned theater. The movie begins, and a slightly edited line from Plato's writings comes on screen. Then, the next minute, a flash, and a gigantic billowing energy ball. In what is a mere 2 minutes of screen time, we see incredible flying stone robot ships engulfed by supersonic tidal wave. The city of Atlantis flooded and destroyed, as an energy field protects the core of it, and in that Platonic night and day is swallowed by the ocean. To say this left a huge impact on my child brain is something of an understatement, as this gigantic video should obviously show you that 2-minute sequence in its glorious 35mm anamorphic ultra-wide format was the big bang that got me madly obsessed with Atlantis. It also directly contributed to my love of archaeology. Well, along with Stargate, but that's for another time. Before we move on to the nature of that Atlantis in particular, I do feel that as an artist, I would like to show my love for what is obviously the best Disney animated film ever, by saying the following two things. Let's mention some background on that film and its amazing artists who brought it to life, and also, fuck Disney. Yes, I ain't no Disney Corporation original much lover. I think personally that the Disney Corporation is a parasitic blight on Western culture. It's a company which, for all of the wonders it brings to Western audiences through its productions, also routinely does some of the wonderful following things as well. Routinely try to cut off support or deny it to critically ill members of its artistic teams. Not pay unionized workers and undercut labor laws. Pretend to be progressive as a corporate smokescreen all to just widen audiences, but we can get rid of the gay characters if China doesn't like it. Underpay or largely not respect the Imagineers, animators, and actors who actually do the bulk of the work. Try to copyright literally everything and absorb the dynamic wonders of human art into its pus-filled, lawyer-ridden, putrid, black, oozing body. And in general, I feel Disney has always taken advantage of the fact it defined the imaginations and childhoods of North Americans, largely to emotionally manipulate them into disproportionately valuing it, while constantly, over and over, sabotaging their own content in the name of profit. And perhaps most heinously of all, editing very real literal history or stories into flavorless, sanded-down products. Is Disney the most evil company ever? Is it Lockheed Martin or Purdue Pharma? No. At least not until Disney/Fox buys up the ailing Boeing company in the late 2040s. But it's insidious. It wears a happy smile and sings and dances while being just as much of a shitheel. So, any defense or arguments presented here on behalf of Disney's Atlantis: The Lost Empire are only really made on behalf of that piece of art and its artists, and are in no ways a defense of the company I would love to end as a smoking crater by the time I die. With that said, we can get to the story of Disney's Atlantis, by which I mean acknowledging and paying respect to the people who made it and how it got made. Because this video is also about stories and how they change. Gary Truesdale and Kirk Wise were two of the main heads behind the Disney Renaissance. Much like with John Musker and Ron Clements, who really wanted to make Treasure Planet, Gary Truesdale and Kirk Wise really wanted to make Atlantis. Its development began sometime around 1996. Perhaps the thing that mostly pisses me off quite a bit is that with both of these projects, also including The Emperor's New Groove, Disney really just wanted to kind of wither and let the traditional animation department kind of die off. Pixar was making them their big money, After the heights of the Disney Renaissance and movies like The Lion King, Disney was mostly interested in the musical formula, and wasn't very interested in keeping up these creator-driven original projects. In spite of this internal pressure, Truesdale, Wise, and writer Tab Murphy, along with producer Don Hahn, would end up making Atlantis. A story which sums up the approach to making Atlantis well is the crew wearing t-shirts which read, "Atlantis, fewer songs, more explosions." They didn't want to make another fantasy musical, they wanted to make an action-adventure story. For the language of Atlantis, they worked with the father of the Klingon language in Star Trek, Mara Krant. They worked out a conlang heavily based on Indo-European, with a fun little alphabet, and an alternating Boustrophedon writing system, which was used by some of the very early languages like Luwian of ancient Anatolia. Speaking of Star Trek, another name that popped out to me was Ricardo F. Delgado, who did a ton of production design on DeepStateNine, and did likewise on Atlantis: The Lost Empire. His very industrial style was a great fit, and I believe the giant caterpillar monster may also have been a Delgado design. So yes, the Deep Space Nine space station and the Ulysses sub are distant cousins. Perhaps the funniest one to mention is one of the main setting and character designers which made Atlantis. You see, several years later, a slightly older Argonbolt was reading comic books and happened upon his, and my still favorite, Western comic book universe, the Hellboy series of Mike Mignola. Wow, this is so nostalgic, young Argonbolt thought. But little did he know the reason was because of Atlantis. Because bingo, Mike Mignola was involved. His influence combined with the 35mm anamorphic aspect ratio is what I think really locked down the look of this movie in its world and characters. As Mignola humorously noted in one interview, "I remember watching a rough cut of the film and these characters have these big square weird hands. I said to the guy next to me, 'Those are cool hands.' And he said to me, 'Yeah, they're your hands.' We had a whole meeting about how to do your hands. It was so weird I couldn't wrap my brain around it." The other wonderful production designers and concept artists like Mike Codd and Jim Martin created a very stylized early 1900s kind of World War I look for many of the vehicles and uniforms. The cool submarines and trucks and the drill toy I never got as a kid, the leviathan I also didn't get as a kid, and the Atlantean architecture. It all rocks. The voice cast as well as the writing generally are still very charming and feel nicely fleshed out for a lean 96-minute runtime. Many lines like "boom, no more Chinese laundry," and "you don't want to know," live permanently tenured in my brain. And to all the other folks who helped get it made, all the hundreds of talented animators and artists who helped make Atlantis, I give a hearty, massive thank you. While I don't respect Disney, I do respect all the work all these folks put in. Disney, the corporation, didn't care about Atlantis because it didn't make $1 billion. But Argonbolt, the person, learned about and grew to love the story of Atlantis because of this film. With that said, let's return to the notion, and really, to this film in a bit more depth. Firstly, let's tackle the big thing. Considering the American Atlantis obsession was catapulted off of Donnelly's book, and the then ensuing stupidity of what was mentioned in the last section, the question emerges. How does Atlantis: The Lost Empire deal with its time period, and notions around ethnicity and culture? Because, after all, if Atlantis' story changes to reflect the society involved in telling its story, that should say a lot, right? Well, the rather pleasing answer, to me at least, also overlaps with a brief summary of the story. Why? How efficient, Argonbolt! Yes, thank you. No, thank you, Argonbolt. First off is the protagonist of Milo Thatch. Milo is a man whose parents died very young and whose grandfather died broken because no one believed his stories of Atlantis. On a surface level reading, wow, Milo is Graham Hancock? Only he isn't. He's a friggin' disgusting, pathetic linguist. That's right, our action-adventure hero is, as Kita puts it, a gangly, big-brained, bespectacled, academic nerd. On the adventure protagonist scale from Alan, oh the noble savages, Quartermain, to Nathan, I swear I'm not just a treasure hunter with 20 tabs of El Dorado pages on Wikipedia open, smooth-brained Drake. We then get Indiana, it belongs in a museum, but man I gotta punch a lot of Nazis, Jones, to Milo. Milo is not a man of action or even really violence. Milo isn't Graham Hancock, he's Daniel Jackson, a person who developed an appreciation of language and human culture, who found a linguistic root, like Proto-Indo-European, tracing it back to a parent culture. As the movie also shows, that Atlantean culture, while advanced and connected through language, is really just the setup and motivation of said adventure, and isn't really some prescriptive notion of human history. It's a cool idea, but ultimately, Atlantis the movie is entertainment, not literal fact. Much like, well, Stargate's Stargate. It's a fun driver for a story, first and foremost. From there, Milo's tale, I would argue, gets more and more admirable in how it uses the adventure to tell its themes. Milo is approached by Mr. Whitmore, an eccentric billionaire and friend of his grandfather, who agreed to fund the Atlantis expedition after the discovery of the Shepherd's Journal in Iceland, the journal being an ancient account of how to get to Atlantis. Milo boards the ultra-kick-ass submarine, meets some of the crew, before they are attacked by Leviathan. Yes, Milo uses the Book of Job Leviathan, not the primordial serpent of chaos Leviathan. And Jiminy Christmas, it's a machine! Cue kick-ass submarine battle. The crew follows the journal down a sunken adventure-laden highway. Milo gets to know the other expedition members, and it does a great job at showing that they are both mainly motivated by greed, but also have hopes and personal dreams. And while it's to them treasure hunting, they do have depth in their motivations. For Milo, though, the journey is one of finding an ancient ruin and the amazing wonders of the culture who created it. You know, like an archaeologist, only afterwards bringing it to the surface to clear his grandfather's reputation. As they close in, though, they find not only is Atlantis still inhabited, but its inhabitants have survived underground for thousands of years as well. This is really where the language stuff comes into play. While serving as Milo's motivation, it also serves as a reason for how the Atlanteans can then speak English with the main cast, which is a double utility. But as Milo meets and then befriends Keita, the princess of the Sunken Realm, something emerges. They have lost much of their ancient knowledge, and even more so their culture and history. Now this, I think, may make some people assume the film is painting the natives as once advanced folks reduced to primitive savages. But I don't think that's entirely what the creators imagined, and they kinda said so themselves. The directors often describe the Atlanteans using Egypt as an example. When Napoleon wandered into Egypt, the people had lost track of their once great civilization. They were surrounded by artifacts of their former greatness, but somehow unaware of what they meant. This is from the producer, Don Hahn. This is also, by the way, why I mentioned the Rosetta Stone before, because information fundamentally is a utility. The ability to practice writing and continue cultural ideals is only as possible as the environment and material conditions provide. Egypt is a good example where it wasn't even necessarily a catastrophe, it was just the time spans and shift in culture which caused it. A 9,000 year difference will do that to you. But as well, the reason the Bronze Age collapse was also relevant was because during it, many languages were outright wiped out. In times of crisis, staying fed and alive takes priority over meticulous culture. And did Atlantis suffer a catastrophe? Yes. Even beyond that, there are many Native American cultures, for example, which had rich languages, but never used or only used very simple systems of writing. So not only is preservation of language fluidic, its invention as well is not as hierarchical or enshrined either. It is then through that language that Milo and Keita find the original goal of the expedition, the great crystal which has powered Atlantis for thousands of years. This is also where the film's strongest message comes out, that Milo Thatch is more hardcore than Indiana Jones. When Rourke, the mercenary treasure hunter leader of the expedition, wants to forcibly take the crystal, even though it will likely snuff out the people and the city, Milo, despite his weak, non-action hero status, stands by his principles that no, not even it belongs in a museum, but it belongs in a respectable relationship with its native culture. Keita tries to defy Rourke, and he ends up fatally wounding the older king of Atlantis. We get a wicked cool sequence in the crystal chamber, and Keita is summoned to embody the crystal heart of the city. But Milo stands by his ideals. This is why Milo also left a big impact on me as a kid. He was not a gun and machete-toting adventure guy, he was a genuine academic. Even if taking the crystal back to the surface would mean honoring his grandfather's legacy and proving the world wrong in the existence of Atlantis, it's not morally or ethically right. Not even because they are Americans with guns and force of arms. I might even dare say that the movie may be one of the few, ever so slightly, post-colonial adventure movies I know of. One of the only Western animated ones for sure. In the end, Rourke and his capitalist greed are the villain, and Milo appeals to the other's humanity, and we get our big showdown complete with flying, lightning-spitting fish and World War I airplanes. The cast of characters which would drive modern culture war people nuts with diversity stop Rourke. Milo saves Kida, and the city is saved by reactivating its cool-as-hell, giant stone mecha statue force field. Ultimately, the survivors decide not to expose Atlantis' secret, and Milo stays behind to be with Kida, now ruling as queen, and help bridge the cultural gap of the people therein. This version of Atlantis, in its own way, is a great reinterpretation. It uses many of the same elements as Donnelly's, but ultimately has a pretty great moral that is, ironically, the polar opposite of Graham Hancock's. Hancock is a man seemingly obsessed with his own victim complex and disregard for genuine archaeology over fame and recognition. While both use Atlantis, ultimately Hancock's is one which inevitably leads to racist conclusions in pseudoscience, whereas The Lost Empires is one which really does emphasize that glory-driven treasure hunting is destructive, and that those same exotic cultures should not be carelessly pilfered. So basically, Hancock would definitely help Rourke steal the crystal just to be famous and then die in a 1914 balloon explosion. Beyond that though, the Lost Empire's version of Atlantis also has a deeper theme which does nicely relate back to Plato's. Ultimately, it is the king, voiced by Leonard Nimoy, who tries to weaponize the crystal heart of the city, which causes Atlantis' doom. Like Plato's original story, the inclusion of this work is basically just as a great parable for how technologies which can produce great energy, perhaps like nuclear power, if used carelessly, can also doom us. In this way, Atlantis' decline is not merely a, natural catastrophe, but like Plato, a parable about how the misuse of power, cultural, technological, or otherwise, can doom and cause great suffering for humankind. In a weird way, this perhaps makes Disney's Atlantis more Platonic than several hundred preceding years of stories about it. But perhaps true to Donnelly's life as well, greed in pursuit of that expansionist power, especially the American one, makes this film also weirdly good at channeling some of Donnelly's beliefs and ideas as well. I think it's a real classic that is often overlooked. Well, there you go. Atlantis, one of my favorites. A good example of stories evolving over time with... Wait, hold on. A guy with glasses, a girl in exotic crystals, the responsibility of taking... Oh, that's right! Did they even make any of this? Or was it... With the boom of the anime industry in post-war Japan, the search for stories that were beloved and hopefully existed in the public domain began. Through programs like World Masterpiece Theater, Japanese audiences were exposed to a huge array of stories like never before. A very, very good example is Anne of Green Gables. A quintessentially Canadian coming-of-age story was adapted into Akage no An, or Red-Haired Anne, leading to years of Japanese tourists showing up in Prince Edward Island, Canada. The technology of the television set made the mass transmission of stories a thing. During this period, however, one story which would never be directly adapted was Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The original 1800s OG big story about the amazing Nautilus and its Captain Nemo. The same story which would give its name to the world's first nuclear submarine of the US Navy. While in the West, Disney would make live-action film adaptation that no doubt inspired the minds of a generation, the same minds that would one day make Atlantis the Lost Empire. In Japan, this work sat never truly adapted. Enter Hayao Miyazaki, the now world-renowned director, bringing a proposal sometime in the early 80s to the Nippon Hoso Kyokai, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, under the name Around the Undersea World, pitching it as a sort of spiritual sequel to Miyazaki's very popular Future Boy Conan. The project, however, never manifested, and in the end, Miyazaki would take some of his ideas and largely rework them to create his landmark work, which cemented Studio Ghibli's creative output and storytelling quality, Laputa, Castle in the Sky. This will be very important later. From this, though, the proposal was left as a possibility. Recognizing the talent of the then still young Studio Gainax, NHK brought this proposal to them. Gainax's abilities had been demonstrated with their Aim for the Top OVA, known more colloquially as Gunbuster, a work that means quite a bit to me personally. They then tried to produce a Ghibli-like, wholly original animated film, Royal Space Force: Wings of Hanamis. The quality of animation and execution in that film was superb, but it did not financially achieve great success. Both of those projects were directly helmed by one of Miyazaki's protégés, Hideaki Anno, now equally as famous for his work Neon Genesis Evangelion. He had worked under Miyazaki on Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, and perhaps it was this combination which motivated NHK to bring them this show, the one which directly preceded Evangelion, Fushigi no Umi Nadia, or as it was translated, Nadia, the Secret of Blue Water. Nadia would face many production issues. Gainax, young and never that good with money, purportedly spent 10 million yen on the early episodes. For comparison, that's the same amount they spent on the much smaller 6-episode Gunbuster. Nadia, on the other hand, was to stretch 39 episodes. This inevitably led to production delays. Animation had to be outsourced, and the later middle half of the show's episodes take a drastic dive in animation quality. According to then-president of Gainax, Toshio Okada, the NHK producer became so enraged at the budget problems he foamed at the mouth and had to be hospitalized, saying, "I told you you could do whatever you want, but I didn't mean to ask you to go this far." It would struggle over the finish line. Ultimately, though, Nadia did get finished, and roughly 12-odd years after I was sitting in that theater watching The Lost Empire, during another pretty hot summer, the one after I watched Evangelion, I watched and found that I really loved Nadia as well. I was desperately craving something to capture Miyazaki's Nausicaa manga, a work I had just read for the first time, and Nadia was the next best thing. Gainax, in the following years, would decline, face legal issues, and have Anno and most of its other talent ultimately leave, before declaring bankruptcy this year in 2024, after a long, slow rotting away. It won't surprise anyone when I say I have zero nostalgia or particular adoration of Gainax, the corporation. Like Disney, it's the artists and their stories I respect. So from The Lost Empire introducing me, it would be Nadia scratching a similar itch. The itch of that Atlantis, that sunken world which would endear me. Despite its flaws, its wacky pacing, and blatant money and time-saving filler episodes desperately trying to keep this series within some kind of budget, I can happily say, having rewatched it recently, I think I still do love Nadia despite all that. So, I think, given the length of this video and what I have talked about, I feel like the most qualified guy to finally address these claims. I love both these things, don't love their parent companies, and clearly adore the idea and history of the story of Atlantis. So let's dig in. The first and most obvious thing is a lot of these claims exist on a very surface level, and that is usually what people use. Lee Zion from the wonderful steaming pile that is Anime News Network commented, "There are too many similarities not connected with 20,000 Leagues for the whole thing to be coincidence." But how deep does really any of that actually run? Like, let's get this big one out of the way. We have a nerdy, male, glasses-wearing, white protagonist, and an exotic, dark-skinned female love interest with a big crystal. On a purely surface reading, these two things seem like an obvious case of copycat, right? Only, Milo and Jean from Nadia are not really as similar once you go further in depth. Jean is a young boy from France who dreams of being a famous inventor. Unlike Milo's liberal arts linguistics, Jean is a hardcore STEM engineering nerd. He builds planes and inventions and machines in general. Ultimately, this is where one of the core themes of Nadia's Atlantis comes in, the use and responsibility of technology. Not just metaphorical power, but literal machines. There's a recurring plot in Nadia where Jean is shown the amazing super technology and the products of Atlantis, the submarine of Nemo being one such, and also being just amazed at it all, but also being told and shown the cruelty of technology used for corrupt or powerful ends, like war, embodied by Neo-Atlantis, an organization hell-bent on using that same advanced technology, like the immensely destructive Tower of Babel, to rule what they see as an inferior mankind. This is one of Nadia's biggest driving ideas, and it does seem to parallel the Lost Empire's king. Like Nemo, the king both see the power of Atlantis as being too great, too advanced to let humans use. But ultimately in The Lost Empire, Milo is only interested in it as a novelty of motivating the expedition and as a supreme crystallization of Atlantean culture. Where The Lost Empire becomes mainly about greed destroying culture, and that power just being a motive for that greed, Nadia is far more focused on the nature of that power, quite directly as being technology. Both stories take place around the turn of the 1900s. Nadia in 1889 and The Lost Empire in 1914. But whereas The Lost Empire is using 1914 as a defining period for its colonial age of exploration and adventure, a good one to ask questions about, Europeans pilfering other cultures' archaeology, Nadia is way more zeroed in on the Empire part. Nadia is a story clearly asking about the, very racist empires of that time. Through Milo, Atlantis is trying to show that higher military power does not mean the right to extinguish human culture. And while Nadia thematically does agree, it does so by creating an even more racist, even more supremacist, super Neo-Atlantis, in a cruel, ironic, Platonic twist to demonstrate that, yes, they are the most powerful, and yes, they almost obliterate 1890s London with a giant laser, for God's sake. Jean here thus follows a very different arc from Milo entirely. His boyish optimism and ideals about the wonders of technology being tested by seeing this supremely more advanced Atlantean power, and how that power and technology is so misused for cruel conquest. By the end of the series, he seems to mainly learn that human life is worth more than the novelty of that technology alone. Milo, I think, always respected it. This then leads to the other big players, Princess Esqueda and Princess Nadia. Their designs seem obviously pretty similar, once again on a surface level, but I'm not sure how much evidence, that is of outright copying or just thematic overlap. Like, there's a bunch of early designs of Esqueda from Mike Mignola, and it's true, some of these do, on a surface level, once again, resemble Nadia. Yeah, they both have a kind of tube top bra thing and like a folded skirt, but this is one of a number of designs for the Atlanteans, and then again, to fairly westernized audiences like Japan and the US, who live at predominantly temperate latitudes and longitudes. The images of exotic tropical cultures like Hawaiians or Africans or Caribbean peoples will appeal in pretty much the same way. This is a pretty overlapping exoticism, a combination of tan skin and exotic hair colors, maybe even some tattoos. Did the Targaryens in A Game of Thrones have white hair and purple eyes because they copied Atlantis? Or do those features work on larger cultural ideas of strange but attractive combinations of attributes? Elena from Street Fighter Third Strike also uses the same idea for another Japanese example. Was Elena ripping off Atlantis? No, once again I think there's just an overlap. And for non-Earthbound, but just broadly exotic science fiction examples, Dingo Egret and Lauren Sahak, two personal favorites, have the same combo used to indicate, respectively, Martian and lunar ancestry. The fact Esqueda's hair is white is also an indicator of the literal multi-thousand-year lifespans of the Atlanteans. It's a visual signal of their defying of normal human mortality as well. Yeah, they're both pretty sporty and generally kind of outgoing, but that's also kind of a natural contrast against a mostly academic protagonist. Colonel O'Neill was the tough, kind of sarcastic military man who could play off of Daniel Jackson's more academic intellectualism. This is just kind of a basic setup. But also, Esqueda is only more vaguely haunted by the diminishing of Atlantean culture. She wants to bring it back, she wants to resurrect it, whereas Nadia is quite literally horrified and depressed by the responsibility her heritage embodies, because it has such an immense tragedy of history within it. But what about the jewel? Yeah, so the jewel is pretty big. Once again, on the surface, they seem identical, but in execution the differences emerge. Nadia and Esqueda's crystals both represent a crystallization of the technology of Atlantis, offering protection and magical powers. Only, all the Atlanteans have crystals, whereas Nadia and Nemo are the only holders of the blue water. While the giant crystal in the Lost Empire is said to work as a repository of human emotions, in Nadia's case her crystal is literally a repository for millions of years and hundreds of thousands of lost human souls. It's a lot heavier and tragic than Esqueda's really. But the actual truth may be that both of these things have another original source. Edgar Cayce, a crazy, self-proclaimed American spirit medium, who, claimed that he had the ability to channel ancient spirits. Amongst his many insane claims was a past life in Atlantis where it was powered by a giant solar-powered crystal. The Lost Empire cites Cayce's claims as its inspiration, so maybe it was copied. Or maybe both works were inspired by Cayce. But here's the thing. That work that also had a crystal necklace and, an even bigger crystal in the heart of a lost civilization? Yeah, that's right. I mentioned it already. Lapida, Castle in the Sky. With a young girl who, has a lost childhood, trying to find out who she is via the crystal, being led to that lost city by a tinkering, kind of engineering-minded boy. That city also harboring an ancient and terrible power contained in a crystal-powered heart, which held a destructive might so great and evil, it was sealed away, and is referenced only in ancient mythology. Laputa and Ghibli movies were definitely noticed and inspired Western creators. John Lasseter wouldn't shut the hell up about how great they were, and the Disney-distributed Ghibli International films. So rather than copying bluntly from Nadia, Atlantis: The Lost Empire may be instead a parallel descendant of Laputa. Nadia, 1,000,000% for sure, is. And perhaps, as I've already said, both lineages simply go back to Edgar Cayce's ideas. This of course leads me to the king in Atlantis: The Lost Empire and Nadia's father Nemo, the ex-king of Tartessos, one of the surviving Atlantean kingdoms. Both thematically want Atlantis' power to be sealed away and not used by the corrupt empires of the world. But once again, in detail, the differences emerge. Nemo, over and over in the series, seems very proud to state that humans in the coming century will achieve great things. Whereas the king in Atlantis: The Lost Empire is, well, kinda just happy with sealing all that stuff away forever. It's also worth mentioning that in Nadia, Nemo is also, Nemo from 20,000 Leagues! Gainax's writers took his backstory as an Indian prince, but really originally as a Polish revolutionary who hated imperialism, and they actually went with it. The Lost Empire might have had a submarine, but beyond that, the Jules Verne that The Lost Empire works on is incredibly vibes-based, first and foremost. But maybe the simplest truth of all is that the nerds who made both were just nerdy in very similar ways. It's the same reason, by the way, that Star Trek phasers shoot Nadion particles, which pass through a Fushigi no Umi crystal, and this showed up first in a book from 1991, after Nadia first aired, written by Michael Okuda, one of the Star Trek TNG setting writers. Under the same submarine hood are pretty similar nerd engines. And let's then consider that technology thing once again, leading me to the big obvious nuclear elephant in the room. Both stories clearly use the imagery of nuclear testing. Giant fireballs and devastating shockwaves to show their technology or power gone too far. Are they copying? Or, the world's first nuclear-armed country was the United States, which in World War II dropped the nuclear weapons on Japan, the creators of Atlantis: The Lost Empire and Nadia, respectively. Wow, what a coincidence. Maybe David Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return also copied Nadia, or maybe this is another thing. Another appealing nugget, another little story, is really just kind of universal, like Atlantis embodying a society doomed by its own hubris. To Plato, that arrogance was in defying good morals and virtues and being cast off by the gods, condemned like with the Chinese mandate of heaven, to suffer and perish in calamities inspired by those which wiped out civilizations during the Bronze Age collapse. But as I have said many times, stories change, and who tells them changes them. To our post-industrialized world, well, climate change is coming back and coming for blood. We have mostly outpaced Mother Nature's once dominant, defining impact on our lives. There is a heat dome this summer, but I have an air conditioner. So in its place, the industrial villain, technology itself, best embodied by humankind's most destructive force, the nuclear bomb, is tapped into the ring to play the part of the biggest baddie. Thus, Atlantis, be it an American or Japanese one, has transformed, like Noah's Ark, to fit our modern world. In that way, Nadia's Atlantis also resurrects something deeply relevant to Plato's work. Wait. Noah's Ark? Noah's Ark? Right, Noah's Ark! I think it's best to wrap this video up with perhaps the thing most people who repeat this narrative fail to grasp. Probably because they never fucking watched Nadia to begin with. Like people claiming things about Atlantis while never reading Plato's Timaeus. Big Disney picking on Gainax is an argument built on similarities. So let's cover the more entertainingly divergent bits of Nadia's Atlantis, shall we? Number 1. Nadia's Atlantis is extraterrestrial in origin. No, not human, but alien. Number 2. Ancient Atlantis and Nadia created humans from evolving African hominids. Number 3. But also Atlantis genetically engineered dinosaurs, which were lost in a great flood, but preserved in Noah's Ark. By which I mean there were actually 3 Noah's Arks, plural, because they were, spaceships. Number 4. Non-Atlantis dinosaurs ruled a dinosaur empire before they went extinct, No, these are probably different from the Atlantean dinosaurs. Yes, this is probably a Getter Robo reference. Number 5. The first human, Adam, was created by Atlantis. Yes, a giant like an Evangelion, because, I'm sorry if you didn't see this coming. Number 6. The Atlanteans in Nadia are from the M78 Nebula. Yes, like Ultraman. So, number 7. Adam was also an Ultraman. Number 8. They also mass-produced Ultramen, and we got several sequences of just gigantic alien body parts, which Evangelion would reuse. Number 9. Gainax loves Thunderbirds by Jerry Anderson, which is why we get an honest-to-Christ Thunderbird 2 launch sequence remake in Nadia. Number 10. Gainax also loves Yamato, so we get the Neo Nautilus recreating entire cuts from Space Battleship Yamato down to framing and all. This isn't in the Disney one. Number 11. But also, the Neo Nautilus is very Thunderbird 1. Number 12. The original Nautilus is also a spaceship with a submarine adaptation built into it. Number 13. Evil Neo Atlantis' Garfish is built from the same mass-produced Atlantean spaceship, but backwards. Number 14. Did I mention Gainax made Gunbuster? Because the Neo Nautilus is named the Eltrium, which appeared in Gunbuster. Number 15. But also it has a left rear catapult damaged like the Exilion, also from Gunbuster. Number 16. Nadia's homeland of Tartessos is actually a reference to a culture that existed in southern Spain. Why is this relevant to anything? Well, because number 17. The crazy archaeologist, more treasure hunter guy, Adolf Schulten, trying to be like his idol, Heinrich Schliemann, insisted on excavating and finding this lost Tartessos, even going as far as to claim Tartessos was perhaps Atlantis, because it was situated near the Pillars of Hercules. The irony here is that Tartessos maybe never existed, and the riches described probably just came from the Phoenician coastal traders. The same traders who had the Temple of Melkart, also called Hercules, because the Greeks associated Melkart with Hercules, so this is one big Atlantis lore deep dive that the Disney one did not mention. Number 18. At many points in Nadia, the quite otaku members of Studio Gainax seem to take opportunities objectifying Nadia, a canonically 14-year-old girl, through the use of fan service and panty shots. I don't like this very much. However, in Atlantis the Lost Empire, Kida is kind of a Babapalooza, but is also canonically over 6,000 years old and an adult, which is an objective improvement, and I think it's good. Number 19. While Disney's mechanical gigantic leviathan is a Eurypterid, Nadia's dual Vern attack is carried out by a humongous orthocone. Number 20. Mari getting married to Sanson is kind of messed up. She should have been Nadia and Jean's adopted daughter. Number 21. Red Noah uses gunbuster-style beam weapon ports. Number 22. Atlantis the Lost Empire made one Conlang and one alphabet, and that's it. Nadia of Blue Water couldn't decide, they'd just make a new one up every time. Number 23. Lincoln Island from the 20,000 Leagues shows up in Nadia. Number 24. Milo has 90s hair. Jean does not. Number 25. Nadia is a vegetarian who refuses to eat meat. Kida is not. Number 26. The Ulysses of Atlantis' Lost Empire is 116 meters long. Nadia's all-purpose submarine, Nautilus, is 152 meters in length. Number 27. Nemo's design is based on both Captain Okita of Space Battleship Yamato and Bruno J. Global of Super Dimension Fortress Macross, which multiple Gainax staff members worked on. Number 28. Gargoyle of Neo Atlantis has a design partially inspired by the Dorok Principalities from Nausicaa, as well as perhaps some of the design elements from the Yokoyama villains. He may have also helped inspire the design of Friend from 20th Century Boys, and he did nothing wrong. Number 29. Elektra's bridge plug suit would inspire the Evangelion designs, and she may have been blonde as a reference to Yuki from Yamato. Number 30. Anton Molier does not appear in Nadia. So, as you can hopefully now see, Atlantis' story in Nadia is not only not something neatly copied by the Last Empire's Atlantis, it's also something, like with all versions of this story, that has been transformed and morphed over time. I won't deny that there's a lot of surface level similarities, nor even that both stories share some pretty big and obvious inspirations. But rather, I would say that, with the same ingredients, the Lost Empire and Nadia ultimately didn't make the same story or really try to. Something as innately appealing as the notion of long-lost civilization, of ruins lurking in the deep, or a submarine diving down to uncover them, are just kind of these broadly appealing things. Like stories that use just the Lost Empire part of Atlantis, or just the submarine from 20,000 Leagues. These are just neat ideas that get reused and remixed. Whether based on real catastrophic tragedy or meant to define a metaphor or allegory of the ideal human world. Whether used by escapists to dream of wondrous locales, or used by racists to excuse a diversity of humanity. Or even more recently, by storytellers to show the evils of imperialism, greed, or technology in destroying human lives and culture. Atlantis can be many things. Plato's original story has been swept behind us on waves thousands of years old. As it changed cultures, changed hands, changed hearts, its meanings and themes shifted. Fools will try still to look for a physical Atlantis, but in never existing their search will be endless. Other fools will try to lay claim to its ownership, but that's like trying to buy the tides. As fiction, as entertainment, Atlantis is untouchable. And so long as things shift, and so long as things are lost, be it to childhood, nostalgia, calamity, or even just simply time, maybe Atlantis, and its appeal, will always sleep just beneath the waters of our mind.